Hey, what's up? Welcome to another episode of Locked on Raptors. On today's show, it's a little self-indulgence on today's show as we're talking about some of my work. If you're new to the show, maybe you've picked the show up on YouTube in the last month or so, and you're not familiar with my work, I am the proprietor of an annual list over at RaptorsHQ.com where I rank every single player in Toronto Raptors history and add the new players from each season into the ranking. Maybe I'll sort of sort things around and move players based on my own whims as well. Either way, it's called Ranking Every Raptor. It's one of the most fun things I do, and I like to talk about it on the podcast. It becomes very easy podcast content as well. So on today's show, we are going to break down the first half of my Ranking Every Raptor list, numbers 249 through 124 or 125. I kind of did it awkwardly because, that's how I do it. There's no real rhyme or reason to anything. But either way, we're talking about Ranking Every Raptor, the first half of the list today, with a whole bunch of guys who will probably be forgotten in short order on last year's Raptors team. But nonetheless, we're going to be joined by Josh Kern from Raptors HQ, the new editor-in-chief of HQ, as we're going to run through the list. And he's going to tell me why I'm wrong and why I'm right and everything in between. That's coming up on today's show. Stick around.
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on? Welcome to episode number 1020 of Locked On Raptors for Tuesday, September the 21st. I'm your host, Sean Woodley of RaptorsHQ.com, and you can find me on Twitter, as always, at WoodleySean. You can find the podcast at Locked On Raptors, and you can find the podcast on all your favorite podcast providers as well, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, Odyssey, all that stuff. Plus, you can follow it on YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube. Be a pal. Be a friend. Subscribe. Hit the button. We're moving towards 700 subs, and we very much appreciate every single one of them, so thank you in advance for hitting that button and supporting the show. All right, on today's show, we are talking about my annual Ranking Every Raptor list over at RaptorsHQ.com. It is an exercise that I started 4 years ago, and I'll be doing it until I'm in my grave, I think, because I'm a completist, I suppose, and I need to have every single player from the Raptors ranked in some sort of specific order, and I've done version 4.0 over the last week or so, or at least the first half of version 4.0. The second half will be coming up later this week. And joining me to dissect the list, tell me why I'm wrong, talk about whether Aaron Baines is too high or too low, should Alex Len be above or below Rafael Araujo, and so much more. It is the brand new editor-in-chief of Raptors HQ, my new boss, Josh Kern. Josh, how's it going, man?
Good, man. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Oh, very happy to have you on the show. Is this your first time on the podcast? Have you been on before?
My very first time on the podcast.
Wow, you get the promotion to managing editor, and then it all comes crashing down when I invite you on the podcast. So sorry to disturb the wave that you were riding there, but we're very happy to have you on the show, man. So yeah, we're going to dig into my Ranking Every Raptor list. Again, you can go to RaptorsHQ.com and read it. It's like one of the top stories on the page right now, so you can go check it out if you have not already. It's also, I believe, my pinned tweet, or it's in my recent tweets, whatever. You can go read it. It is like my favorite thing I do every year. I spend way too much time thinking about it. I spend way too much time comparing the virtues of Roger Mason and Omar Cook to various members of the current Toronto Raptors. But hey, it's a good time nonetheless. So let's dig into the list here, Josh. We're going to kind of go sort of reverse order, and then we'll just sort of assess whether I went wrong or right in where I ranked a lot of these guys. And let's start with some of the bigs that dotted the Raptors roster last season, Josh. We'll get later on into sort of Paul Watson Jr., Yuta Watanabe, some other interesting players who moved a little bit higher in the rankings, but sort of first-time guys who make their first appearance in the rankings, and surely their last appearance, because I don't think they're getting invited back. Let's start there. Alex Len. Let's begin with him. He's the first entry on this year's list. He comes in at number 234 on the list, and I chose to put him one spot higher on the list than number 235, Rafael Araujo. He's also in the mix with like Euro Slowcar at 236. Ronald Dupree is at 233. These are names you may or may not remember, as Alex Len is a name you may or may not remember in 20 years' time. Did I err in putting Alex Len as the first entry on the list here? And I think the important thing is the Hoffa Meridian. That is what I call where Hoffa is. If you're below Hoffa, you are an embarrassment. If you're higher than Hoffa, you're less than an embarrassment. Alex Len, his 7 games with the team, did he warrant being placed one spot higher than Hoffa, Araujo, Josh Kern?
Well, first of all, it was surprising to me to see that 7 games played number there because I honestly didn't remember that he played in that many games. But yeah, I think it is right to put him above Hoffa, because the one thing that I do remember about Alex Len is he had all those 3-pointers against the Knicks, and you mentioned that in the piece. And I have no memory of Hoffa doing anything in his time with the Raptors. So, it balances out. I think he deserves to be a little higher than Hoffa.
Yeah, Hoffa played, I think, 2 seasons with the team, but it was all very bad. And
Yes.
I think the reason he gets hit, like, there are guys who played, in his range, guys who played like 2, 3, 4 games with the team, 7 games in the case of Alex Len. Usually this is the range for guys who were on like 10 days, or guys who didn't play at all, like Alonzo Mourning and Kenny Anderson, who are the ceremonial bottom 2 every year, despite never having played for the team. But with Hoffa, like, his existence on the team was so damaging. His draft pick in place of, Andre Iguodala, or name any other player from the first round of that draft, which, none of them stand out as being all that great, but all were better than Hoffa. I think that is why he gets sort of knocked down pretty seriously in the rankings. And yeah, when you're in this range, in the 200s out of 249 players that we're talking about, the little tiny things that people remember are going to be enough to nudge you ahead a few spots. And those few threes against the Knicks in the first win of the Raptors season, when they, I believe, were 0-3 and looked pretty rough against the Knicks in that first half as well, until Len started hitting all those corner threes. That was enough to bump him up for me. I couldn't go any higher. I guess, sort of thinking back to when he was cut, do you have any sort of ill will towards the Raptors for moving on from Alex Len? He went on to have a pretty reasonable season with the Wizards, of course, in that bizarro big man rotation. But, are you upset, or are you thinking, he was not going to be the answer to the problems anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think upset would be too strong of a term. Certainly. Alex Len wasn't making a difference for last year's Raptors team either way, but it is still weird to me that, given their big man struggles at the time, obviously as well before Khem Birch joined up, that they would cut a big man who was, I mean, obviously not great, but certainly capable. And that, they kept Aaron Baines around for the whole season. And I don't know. I mean, I couldn't tell you whether Baines or Len was the better player, because they were both pretty awful. So it's still weird to me that they made that cut, especially as early as they did. If they maybe waited till closer to the trade deadline or something, it might have made more sense to me. But yeah, it's still a strange thing. But yeah, I can't say that I have any ill will towards that move.
No, I think at the time it was kind of jarring, but also, like, it kind of signaled, I think, their move to playing small ball a little bit. And we're like, okay, we don't really need this extra center on the team who's just going to take up space and not really fit into our defense. And it did kind of clear the way for them to play small and actually have the run where they were good for a while. People forget that happened. They were a good team until the plague hit. And Alex Len's departure, in a way, was the domino that began it all. Maybe we should bump him up a little higher on account of that. Speaking of bigs, we don't need to talk about Henry Ellenson, who I put a little bit higher than Len despite playing just 2 games. He had pretty productive efforts in his 2 games, 7.5 points, 6 boards, 2.5 assists in his time. He was a plus 17 in his debut when he was on a 10-day. Did not come back because the man cannot play defense. My favorite stat from the piece, 83 career games played for Henry Ellenson, 3 career blocks, 2 of which came in the same game. Just a wild, strange lottery pick of the last half decade or so. Rodney Hood comes in at 215. I guess we can briefly talk about Rodney Hood before we get to Aaron Baines. Did you have any sort of belief that Big Rod was going to be something that could kind of turn the tide for the Raptors' second unit? I remember he had that 13-point game against Portland in his second game, and it was like, oh, all right, some self-creation off the bench. This is interesting. Are you at all bitter about the ending of the Rodney Hood era? Do you think there could have been more there, or was it basically exactly what we all should have expected?
I think it was what we should have expected. I think, from a personal standpoint, I kind of thought that maybe he would have done more just because that's kind of who he is, and kind of felt like, I don't know, his career was kind of in the balance a little bit, right? If he had made an impact
Yeah.
with the Raptors, could have led to another contract down the road. He had a early, was it a team option this year, right?
Hmm.
That the Raptors didn't pick up, I believe. But yeah, I mean, injuries obviously played a part of it. He couldn't stay healthy, which is kind of the story of his career.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the one hand, yeah, I did expect more from him just in terms of like stats and things like that, but I certainly didn't expect that he was going to make much of an impact on the team overall. I mean, I think again, the fortunes of last year's team were set certainly by that point,
Yeah.
post COVID and everything. So yeah, I mean, I think his ranking on this list is maybe a bit high, given that he had such a limited impact in such a short amount of time. But again, when you start to look at the players around him on the list, it's kind of like, oh yeah, he's one spot ahead of Sean Marks. Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, he's right between Sean Marks and DJ Augustine, where
Yeah,
everybody dreams of being when they start their NBA career.
yeah,
Yeah, Hood, I think it more spoke to like the dire state of the Raptors' second unit, that
yes.
like his little tiny bit of self creation and his like smooth looking lefty stroke were like, oh, this is pretty interesting coming off the bench. But yeah, I don't think there was ever much to hope for there. Honestly, the biggest hope was Rodney Hood would be involved in a draft day trade. My Miles Turner agenda fell apart pretty quickly there, but he is no longer on the team. He is, I think, going to camp with the Bucks. So good luck to him as he tries to make it work in Milwaukee. We're going to get to Aaron Baines, who is one of the sort of, I think, key figures in this section of the list. We'll get to him in 1 second here to continue on our assessment of my Ranking Every Raptor, first half of my Ranking Every Raptor version 4.0. We'll get to that in 1 second here. But first, I want to tell you about our friends over at SweatBlock, who are making your shirts dry. I don't know what to say. That's like the best way to describe it. They bring you antiperspirant wipes, deodorant, a bunch of other wonderful products as well. And they are guaranteeing that your shirts are going to stay dry from your excessive sweating. It is doctor created, doctor recommended, and works for up to 7 days per use. And it is the #1 Amazon earned antiperspirant right now in that category on Amazon. So it's working. People like it. And I like it too. I am a customer of SweatBlock because it works for me. SweatBlock is stronger and more effective than most clinical antiperspirants. You simply apply it at night before going to bed. Then you wake up, wash, go about your day without worrying about sweat, guaranteed. It's amazing. It takes a few hours to set in while you sleep, and then you wake up, and then boom, excessive sweating is no more. I know it's going to sound too good to be true, but I literally only have to use SweatBlock once or twice a week, and it keeps me dry the whole time. And I'm a person who sweats a lot. That is impressive. That is a feat that SweatBlock has achieved here. No more pinning out, no more picking your shirts based on which one will hide sweat better. If you or someone you love deals with excessive sweating and is uncomfortable talking about it, doesn't want to live with it anymore, you have to check out SweatBlock. Get it today for 20% off at sweatblock.com or with the promo code LOCKEDON, or you can go to Amazon and CVS and pick it up as well. Today's show is also brought to you by our pals over at DirecTV Stream. Does this sound familiar? You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another that lets you stream your favorite shows. You're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friends log in for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all that entertainment you love without the hassle and get your TV together, and that is called DirecTV Stream, baby. It is bringing you live TV and on-demand sports favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports movies and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes, no more need to buy a new device ever again. And the best part, there is no annual contract. Get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directtv.com. That's directtv.com. Compatible device required. Content varies by package. All right, Josh, let's continue on here. We were going to talk about Aaron Baines off the top, but he deserves, I think, almost a full segment to himself because he's an interesting character in Toronto Raptors history. I think Aaron Baines, in a lot of ways, was kind of set up to fail with the Raptors. He was replacing two beloved franchise icons. He was being asked to sort of replicate an outlier season that he put together with Phoenix. He was being asked to relocate to Tampa when his wife was giving birth to a new child, like days before the season. There was a lot going on with Aaron Baines, and I feel for the guy because by the end of the season, it became like a big fat pile-on fest, and it was not really fair to him. The team, I think, kind of showed its ass in a lot of ways when talking about Baines too. I put him in at number 176 on this list. He is stuck in between John Long at 177, NBA champion Jody Meeks is at 178 for reference, Michael Curry at 175. A similarly frustrating player, I think, if I think back to the days of Michael Curry on the Raptors. Aaron Baines, maybe this is a little bit high for the performance he put in this season. He really, really detracted from all the Raptors lineups that he played in. But, he put up some production. He had some moments here and there. And in this range, it's not hard, like I said, to kind of move up a few spots with a couple good games, frankly. What are you sort of thinking about with the Aaron Baines experience, Josh? Like, do you sort of view it as like this unequivocal failure of Baines? Do you view this as like a Raptors failure? Like, how do you sort of, now that we've had some time to sort of digest and move away from last season and kind of get some distance, how are you sort of viewing the Baines experience in Toronto?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a little bit equally between the team and Baines. And I also think there's a sort of a fan expectations factor that comes in too, right? I mean, we're used to the
Sure.
Raptors, being a really successful team for the past several years before last season. We're used to seeing big men come in and have, a solid impact with guys like Kyle Lowry to feed them the ball.
Hmm.
And maybe that set us all up for having high expectations for Baines, especially again, he had that solid season in Phoenix. Maybe we didn't think that was an outlier. Maybe we thought that was who he was. But at the same time, I think if we look at it a little bit more critically and say, well, the guy was 33, 34 years old. Players don't really change that much at that stage in their careers. It probably was more of an outlier than an actual sort of gradual change in his career
Hmm.
trajectory at that point. But yeah, I mean, that said, all the other factors that you mentioned, the rust, because the guy hadn't played in a long time. He had COVID the previous summer,
Hmm.
didn't play in the bubble, playing in Tampa. And then, yeah, trying to fill the shoes of two beloved players who everybody loved because of their personalities, but also just because of their production on the court,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you can look at Marc Gasol's numbers and say, well, he wasn't that productive, but obviously his impact on the defense was, sensational. And to expect Baines to come in and fill those shoes was a high bar to ask. That said, his inability to seemingly catch the most basic of passes or grab a rebound with two hands as opposed to punching it in the air was
Hmm.
just incredibly frustrating to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of like the short list of most infuriating Raptors to watch. He's certainly on it. Like,
Yeah.
if you're talking about like free agent signings, obviously he didn't make as much money as Damari Carroll or Hito Turkoglu, but in terms of like underperforming dollar amount earned in free agency, like he's right there with those guys. Like Damari Carroll played in the playoffs and had some moments, and Hito Turkoglu, well, he didn't do anything except for being pizza commercials, which were fun. But
Yeah.
but like yeah, it's tricky because as much as I say that he was kind of set up to fail, he was also in a lot of ways set up to succeed by the infrastructure the Raptors had in place, right? Like there was
Yeah.
not a lot being asked of Aaron Baines coming into the season. It was, shoot threes when they come to you, and he did that very eagerly with Phoenix. And it wasn't a matter of replace Serge Ibaka like for like in terms of pick and pop threes and stuff, but the volume you thought would be there, and the accuracy certainly was not. He shot like 26% from three.
Mhm.
Rebounding was a big thing, of course. Like they're a
Yeah.
small team. They struggle with rebounding. They play small a lot. They play tiny guards. Like they needed some rebounding from the bigs, and Aaron Baines could not provide that whatsoever. It seemed like whenever he was even just like a tiny step out of position, he was getting beat for offensive boards. As you said, often sort of volleyballs, spiking balls into the third row for no real apparent reason. It was tricky to sort of navigate and sort of know where the Raptors blame ended and the Baines blame began. You know, there was a lot there to set up to help him succeed. I remember I wrote like a season preview for Baines and thought like, okay, this is like a totally reasonable backup plan the Raptors have gone with here. I still think if there's a 5% chance of signing Giannis, you keep that window open, even though that window closed very soon after the free agency period with Giannis signing the Supermax. I still think the logic behind it made sense. And I think, I've made this point before on the show. The way Kem Birch came in and played well, kind of out of nowhere, kind of proved they were right that you can fill the center spot with a mercenary type player and be just fine. They just picked the wrong guy in Baines. And, as much as they had a lot of perimeter defense there to kind of protect him and insulate him, he was not cut out at all for Nick Nurse's style of defense. And then, where does the blame go for Nurse not changing his defensive stylings to more matches personnel? That's also something to consider too here. So, it sucks, man. I feel for Baines. He seemed like a good dude. He seemed like a nice locker room guy and all that. And I thought, by the end of the season, it had gotten a little bit over the top. Like the Adrian Griffin quote after they signed Kem Birch, and it was like, oh,
Yeah.
finally we have bigs for the first time since Mark and Serge. Like, come on, dude.
Yeah, that was harsh.
Yeah. Do you have any last lingering Aaron Baines thoughts? I'm going to have them in nightmare form for a long time, but do you have any others for the podcast?
Yeah, no, I'm on board with you there. I guess the only thing I would say is that it's very easy to say like, oh, whatever, it was a bad signing. To your point, if you're gonna keep that window open for Giannis, even if it's a slim window, you want to do it. But also, like, you can't really compare it to a signing like DeMar Carroll. I mean, he had a 4-year contract, right? Baines was 2 years, and the second year was the team option. Like, for $8 million, like it's a very small risk, right? And yeah, it didn't pay off, but I mean, whatever. They move on.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like it's an albatross around size neck or Bobby Webster's neck for the next 3 years.
Yeah, that's very, very true. We continue on. I'll just hit on a couple more guys here, sort of in the next range, and then we can move on and talk about sort of Yuta Watanabe is kind of the main guy I want to talk, and then we'll talk about who is not in the first half of the list as well to close things out in the final segment. But Jalen Harris and Freddie Gillespie I want to talk about. So Jalen Harris comes in at 166, has that really strong finish to the season, scores double figures in I think 4 or 5 straight games, has the 30-point game against Dallas. Freddie Gillespie in at 161. Just a godsend with his just basic ability to grab a rebound. That was kind of nice. Obviously, very good content provider as well, singing for the team at practice, kind of lifting the vibes up a little bit. These guys, I think Freddie Gillespie stands a chance of moving up if he makes the team, although that's up in the air at this point, considering how he played at Summer League. Jalen Harris may not get a chance to play in the NBA again because the NBA has dumb rules against testing adult grown-ass men for drugs. Do you think I kind of landed on the right spots with these guys? Harris, I have between Greg Steemsma at 167 and Solomon Alabi at 165, another guy who played a brief time with the team, but also had a couple of nice big performances before never appearing in the NBA again. And Freddie Gillespie appears between Mamadou Ndiaye and Marcus Banks, who is at 160. Thoughts on, let's start with Harris, I suppose. Sure. How much do you think he could have climbed this year had the drug test not taken place? I guess that's maybe the place to begin with him.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of potential in Harris, especially for a team that was kind of starved for offense at times, right? The guy could shoot, and it's a bummer that he's not going to be around. Let me ask you though, if based on how you'd sort of do these rankings, if he was still on the team this year, would you have maybe slotted him in a bit higher, knowing that there's potential for him to move up?
No, I try not to over predict what's going to happen when there's a very sound methodology behind this list, Josh. No, I try not to go on future performance. For example, not to spoil anything, but Pascal Siakam, I think he's probably going to climb past Chris Bosh at some point here, but I'm not going to put him past there until he's actually done it. Same with Jalen Harris. I think at some point he'll climb past Maceo Baston, but he hasn't done it yet. He hasn't proved it yet. But yeah, I guess maybe subconsciously I might have, but it is tricky because he only had those 13 games. There's only so much you can do with it, and only so much you can kind of bump him up the rankings based on 1 30-point game, as much as I don't think any of the guys in this range ever had a 30-point game. So I guess he kind of has that feather in his cap over some of these other guys. But yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about where he would have probably slotted into the rotation this season. I don't think he would have been in the clear bench rotation or anything like that. He probably would have gotten some 905 time, even though they're pretty heavy on guards down there. He probably still would have been in that mix there. But yeah, I think, a climb into near the top 100 probably wouldn't have been out of the question if he was the 12th man on the Raptors and, some injury fill in or whatever, maybe Goran Dragic gets dealt and that opens up a spot in the guard rotation. Totally would have been room for him to at least kind of have the production over the course of a larger chunk of games to move up. Again, it doesn't take a lot to move up here. But it's a shame, man. Is he someone that you'd like to see them bring back down the line, or is it more of it was nice, but maybe they can find a similar type player, as much as the human side of things, where I hope the Raptors are offering as much support to him as they possibly can is the thing in terms of personnel. Are you sitting there fawning over Jalen Harris, the lost sort of potential star that was Jalen Harris? Or are you kind of all right with David Johnson's here now? That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as much as I enjoyed that 30-point game and sort of seeing him, score off the bounce in that 13-game stretch, shooting guards like that are kind of a dime a dozen. I mean,
Sure.
he didn't really stand out above and beyond what I think the average kind of shooting guard prospect would bring to the table. So no, I'm not necessarily fawning over him, but yeah, I mean, I'd be happy if they brought him back. To your point, if there is a way the Raptors can support him the next sort of step in his journey and getting himself back to the NBA, I think that would be great. But yeah, it's not somebody that I'm like, really ashamed to see him go or anything like that. I am glad that you mentioned the 905 though, because I do think that's maybe a factor in where some of these guys might net out when you think about. Yeah, I mean there was a G League bubble last year, and Harris and Flynn got some time there. But if they had the opportunity to have a full season with a 905, then who knows where they might have landed on this list, right? So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Maybe they don't get into the NBA at all, frankly, if things are different, right? Like, Jalen Harris could have been a 905er who never made the list, if not for other circumstances, taking over the Raptors season in a very terrible way. Quickly on Freddie Gillespie before we move on, I hope he makes the team for his sake. I'm not rooting for anybody to lose money or lose shots at NBA earnings or anything like that. Do you think he's going to make the team at this point? He was pretty rough in Summer League, and Precious Achiuwa very clearly ahead of him. Obviously, Kem Birch is ahead of him. And I would argue that, OG, Scotty Barnes, Pascal are probably ahead of him in terms of guys who are going to get money at the 5. Chris Boucher, too. Yeah. Do you think they could kind of reallocate that roster spot elsewhere? Or what's your sort of vision here for Freddie Gillespie coming into the year?
Yeah, I mean, I think coming into Summer League, I thought he was definitely aligned to make the team. But yeah, that was a really rough performance from him in Summer League. And to your point, the roster is pretty full at this point, and they've got guys that I think they see a future around. Whereas Gillespie was, kind of a project last year, and yeah, it was a nice story, but difficult to see that there's necessarily a huge lot of potential in front of him when you look at guys like, Barnes or Delano Banton. Those guys obviously they seem to have a little bit more invested in at this point. So
yeah, we'll see about Freddie Gillespie. He very well could be a one-time entrant at 161, and we will always love his Party in the USA rendition.
Yes.
We're going to continue on and finish up and hit on some of the last few guys in the first half of the list and look ahead to part 2 coming up later on in the week. We'll get to that in 1 second. But first, I want to tell you about our friends over at Sleeper, which is like a new version of fantasy basketball that would actually maybe convince me to play fantasy basketball. I usually get roped into a league every year, just like last minute. I'm feeling the basketball vibes. Someone says, hey, we need a person for our fantasy league. And I say, yes, please, I'll join. That sounds fun. And then within 2 weeks, I'm sick of it because I don't like picking lineups every single day. I just can't do it. I can maybe do it for baseball because baseball is a little bit more of a sleepy sport and you can kind of set your lineup at the beginning of the week and let it roll. Can't do that with fantasy basketball, but that's okay because Sleeper is a brand new way of playing fantasy basketball. It's called Game Pick, and it's only available on Sleeper. In Game Pick, owners pick a single game per week for each starter to count towards their total team score, ensuring an even number of games played between opponents. You don't get this thing where you just win because your team plays 5 games because the NBA's schedule is insane. The days of losing because your opponent's players simply had more games scheduled to play are over. The days of mindless daily busy work are over as well. And boy, does that speak to me because I hate the busy work of fantasy sports. It's supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to be work. In Game Picks, you get 1 game per week for each player based on player matchups, home versus away, opponent's defensive ranking, pace of play, and more. And all of that adds up to more strategy and less busy work. You get to choose the games you want to use your players in. That is great. And you can outwit your friends and beat your friends, which is what fantasy sports is all about. Whether you prefer redraft, keeper, or dynasty, Game Picks has you covered. Sleeper, crack the fantasy basketball code. If you play fantasy football and you like the weekly sort of option of it, then you're going to love Game Pick for fantasy basketball as well. Download the Sleeper app and start a league with your friends today. You will not be disappointed with the most strategic fantasy basketball experience in the industry. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends over at Theragun. And look, I'm a person with a garbage body. I try to work out and be active and all that stuff, but it hurts me when I do it. I go play some softball, my legs hurt for 3 days. I go for a bike ride, my lower back kills and my legs are sore, my calves are sore, all of that. Well, guess what? The stress of daily life doesn't have to weigh on your body, whether you're an elite athlete or someone like me who is decidedly not an elite athlete and you just want to make it through the day tension-free. Theragun can help. It is the handheld percussive therapy device that releases releases your deepest muscle tension using a scientifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power, and it's as quiet as an electric toothbrush. The Gen 4 Theragun doesn't just feel good, it gets to the source of the pain by releasing tension using Theragun's signature percussive therapy, which goes 60% deeper than vibration alone. Whether you want to treat your muscle tension from working out or an injury or just the stresses of everyday life, there is no substitute for the Theragun Gen 4. The OLED screen and design make you feel like you're holding something from the future. Go to their site, check it out. And the Theragun app learns from your behaviors and suggests guided routines as well. Theragun is trusted by more than 250 professional sports teams like Real Madrid and elite athletes like Paul George, DeAndre Hopkins, and Maria Sharapova. Hundreds of thousands of customers and me, baby. Try Theragun for 30 days starting at only $199. Go to Therabody, THERABODY.com/lockedon right now and get your Gen 4 Theragun today. That's Therabody.com/lockedon, Therabody.com/lockedon. All right, Josh, let's finish up here with our look at the sort of top of the charts in the first half of the ranking Every Raptor list. A few guys who are making their second appearances on the list: Paul Watson Jr., Patrick McCaw, Matt Thomas. Watson comes in at 147. McCaw comes in at 141, dropping down 6 spots. And Matt Thomas is in 130, dropping down 21 spots. I may have gotten a little overzealous with my ranking of Matt Thomas last year, which is fine. We were all caught up in it. I blame Alex Wong. And then Yuta Watanabe comes in at 125. We don't have to talk about all these guys, but does any ranking here particularly interest you, Josh? Or are you particularly angry about where I've placed anybody in this group of guys?
Not angry, no. Like you, I kind of forgot that Patrick McCaw was around last season. We had those, what was it, 5 games, barely played. Yeah, kind of a bummer to see him drop after what was something that wasn't really in his control, his injuries and things like that, especially considering how much of a punching bag he was from the fans, right? For his, some of his proclivities the season before. So kind of not really his fault, but I guess that's the way it goes. A little bit disappointed, not to see where Paul Watson is on the list, but just that we're not going to get to see him rise up any further. But possibly, I guess there's always a chance he could come back. But yeah, I thought there's still a lot of potential in Paul Watson. And again, another guy whose season was just kind of cut short and in a way that had nothing to do with him or his faults. So yeah.
Yeah, Watson has 30 points in a game against Orlando. The next game, I think he goes 0 for 10, which was interesting. And then that's the end. That's his last game as a Raptor as he got COVID and missed the rest of the year. Real bummer. This kind of like a bummer crew, honestly. Like the Thomas, McCaw, Watson range in the list. Like Thomas was, I think, in line for rotation minutes this season and could just never capitalize. Yes, Nick Nurse didn't really trust him a whole lot, but also you kind of have to play a little bit of defense. And I think it kind of was proven that the reasonable defense he played in the bubble was far more sort of an outlier than anything else. Like he just, especially with the lesser supporting cast around him this year on defense, there was just nowhere to hide him. You couldn't hide him in those zones. He was just running around like a chicken with his head cut off, like you saw in his rookie season for most of the time he was on the team. So it's a bummer it didn't quite work out. He didn't, he shot 40% from 3 as he's wont to do, but he just never shot. Like the defenses knew, okay, this guy's on the floor to take threes. We're going to take those threes away. And there wasn't a whole lot you could do. There's only so much you can do when you have exactly one marketable NBA skill. And, I've spoken with our pal David Locke from Locked On Jazz, the grand poobah of the network. He was not exactly pleased with watching Matt Thomas down in Utah either. So, I think the Raptors just getting a second rounder, one of those 2 second rounders that became Banton or Johnson, I don't know which one. Nice little bit of business for the team there. McCaw, it sucks. The injury is terrible. That said, the point I made in the piece about him is that I think he's kind of had the platonic ideal of an NBA career, for me at least. Played 5 seasons, won 3 titles, made $11 million, goes out, not really having a whole lot of responsibility. Pretty tight to me. It's like me wanting to be a relief pitcher. Yeah, like being a long reliever in Major League Baseball, also the dream career. I think Patrick McCaw, kind of the long reliever of Raptors players on this list. So yeah, that's fun. And then we get to Yuta Watanabe, who comes in at 125. And I think probably stands the chance of being the highest riser on next year's list. This is kind of always the thing I'm looking at. This year's highest riser appears in the next section. We will not spoil that just yet, but Yuta comes in at 125, played 50 games, 4.4 points, 3.2 boards, really kind of progressed as the season went along, especially as a shooter, kind of got emboldened to, go bombs away more often. What was your sort of thought on the Yuta season, his first season in Toronto, and what are your expectations for him going into next year?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly exceeded all expectations last year, I think. Even just seeing him at 125 on this list, I mean, I don't know if it speaks more to him or more about like how terrible some of these other guys are
Yep.
in Raptors history. Probably a little bit of both. But yeah, I think he has a huge opportunity even in front of him this year. I mean, the roster is very much in flux, right? And I think there's lots of room for guys to make an impact. And hopefully, Nick Nurse will be sort of flexible and sort of saying, okay, well, I see this guy's putting the time in, he's putting the work in, he's making the impact. I'm going to give him more minutes. I'm going to reward him with more minutes. And a guy like Yuta, I mean, he can kind of do it on both ends. I mean, he's obviously, it's difficult to judge a lot based on last season because it was kind of such a lost season. But just on the surface of it, I mean, he played, defense with high energy. As you said, sort of opened up his shooting game as the year went on. Some of that sort of attitude and that energy that he brought to the floor is kind of what I think a lot of us are expecting from Scotty Barnes this year. That's kind of what he was showing in Summer League and even just in his attitude. These guys that really seem to enjoy playing basketball and really seem to want to just fly around out there and do whatever they can. Maybe there's opportunity to rein that in a little bit and direct it in an effective way. But yeah, it's kind of great to see that, right? Especially when a team is in transition like that. Those are the kind of players that you want to watch and you want to root for.
Yeah, and I mean, he certainly fits the vision of the team, just based on the moves they've made, right? He's 6'8", 6'9". He's a good defender. He can switch a bunch of positions. Like, I could see him, if they really want to get weird with it and play just like jumbo ball, and they want to go with like a Barnes, OG, Siakam trio flanked by some other long weirdos, like throw Yuta in there. Why not? Like, see what happens, I guess. Like, make Pascal the point guard for all I care. Make Scotty Barnes the point guard. Dot the perimeter with Chris Boucher and Yuta Watanabe, and maybe you're cooking with something weird and fun for 3 minutes at a time. I think the fact that Pascal's going to miss the start of the season also bodes well for Yuta kind of carving out more of a role. He figures to me to be like the 11th guy in the rotation at the moment, but with Pascal out, obviously those are some minutes at the 4 that can be filled in. And we certainly know what he brings on the defensive end. I think like his playmaking is kind of slept on too. Like, I think he's a good passer. He didn't really get a lot of chance to like be a playmaker last season because he was more of a play finisher, but I think, that's an interesting little wrinkle to his game as a 5th guy standing around, attack a closeout, make a dump off pass, that type of thing. I don't think his jump's going to be terribly like dramatic or anything like that. But if you're looking at the list, in the range of like 80, 75, you get like Jermaine O'Neal and Sean Marion. Like, it's not exactly hallowed ground that you're trying to make up to get into that range. And I think there's very real possibility for, a 30, 40 spot jump for Yuta this season. I'm a big fan. And I think he's, there might be some people who think he's like maybe not a shoe in to make the team. I think he's for sure making the team. And, we'll see from there. Yeah. What were you going to say?
Oh, I would be shocked if he didn't make the team at this point. I think something pretty awful would have to happen in camp for that to happen. And hopefully nothing like that does happen. But yeah, I mean, I think to your point too about Pascal being injured, that opens up a big opportunity. And also just if the season kind of doesn't go in the right direction, and we see something similar to last year, where if guys are a little bit banged up, maybe they take an extra game or 2 off. Like, there's going to be lots of opportunities for those guys in the middle of the roster, towards the end of the roster, to make an impact or have an opportunity to show what they can do. So,
absolutely, Yuta seems like a real gem, real nice keeper, and a very good find by the Raptors. Let's quickly look ahead to part 2 of the list. Obviously, we'll get the top 10 and all that stuff and the important things there. Is there anything in particular you're intrigued? Any players' rankings you're particularly excited to see, Josh, going into part 2?
Yeah, well, I think just looking back at last year's roster and kind of these one and done type guys, DeAndre Bembry stands out to me as a guy who had some ups and downs for sure, but seemed to again fit that mold that you mentioned of like, tall and long and can guard multiple positions. So I mean, a bit surprising that there seemed to be no interest in bringing him back. But also, to be honest, kind of thought he would fall on this sort of the bottom half of the list. So kind of a pleasant surprise to see that he's going to be in the top half. And then beyond that, I mean, my guy Stanley Johnson, who was, I think 195 on last year's list. Looks like it's going to be a huge jump for Stanley. Happy for him that he was able to at least get some moments last year. Playing out of position, obviously, showing what he can do on the defensive end. Obviously, still a very raw player on offense, but
yeah. Bembry and Johnson will appear pretty soon in the next half. Johnson, I'll spoil it. Johnson's the highest riser on the list this season, which I guess speaks to the quality of last year's Raptors team. But someone's got to be the high riser, and it was in fact Stanley Johnson. I think Chris Boucher makes a pretty big leap as well. The thing I am excited to kind of dig into, and I think people might yell at me, is where I have Fred VanVleet. I'm not going to spoil it just yet. You have to wait for the piece to drop later in the week. But I have Fred pretty high and past a certain legend that I think people might agree with, because recency bias is nice and everyone loves Fred, but it might be a bit of a controversial take. I don't know. We'll see. That's going to come up later in the week. I'm going to be joined actually on Friday's podcast by Freddie Rivas of the Confederacy of Dunks podcast, as we're going to run through the top 124 because round numbers, who cares? 124 it is. We're going to run through the rest of the list, and Freddie's going to dissect the list and tell me why I'm wrong and why I'm right and all that stuff, just like Josh did here today. Josh, that will do it for today's episode, though. Thank you so much for being here, man. It was lovely to chat with you. Lovely to have you on the show for the first time. And thank you for assisting me in my self-indulgence, doing a podcast about pieces I write. It's very, very nice of you. Where can people check out your work, man?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And yeah, you can find me obviously at raptorshq.com. And of course on Twitter at Joshua Kern or at RaptorsHQ.
Awesome. We'll have lots of great stuff at HQ coming this season, game coverage, all that good stuff, as we'll be back in the building. It's unbelievable. I don't even remember if I know how to get in the building after almost 2 years away, but I'll make my way. We'll help Josh get in there too. That will do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll probably be back with an episode on Thursday, topic TBD, but likely we'll have something Thursday for you. And then on Friday, Freddie Rivas, as promised, will join to break down the second half of Ranking Every Raptor version 4.0. Again, if you want to read the piece, the link to Ranking Every Raptor version 4.0, 249 to 125, very, very wordy title. It will be in the link for the YouTube page as well as the podcast, so you can go read that if you have not already. Thank you in advance, and we'll talk to you again later in the week with another episode of Locked On Raptors. Bye-bye.